You're spending 3 hours every weekend fighting weeds and replacing plants that died over winter while your neighbor harvests dinner from the same square footage in 15 minutes, and you're wondering what you're doing wrong. Here's what nobody at the garden center will tell you. 20 strategic plants can eliminate most of your garden maintenance, slash your grocery bills, and run themselves for decades. Not exotic species, not expensive rarities. Common plants that Japanese gardeners identified centuries ago as wealth multipliers. They produce food, medicine, and materials while improving your soil and protecting each other from pests. But garden centers don't stock these plants heavily because they solve problems permanently instead of creating repeat customers. I've spent years studying why traditional Japanese gardens feel effortless while Western gardens consume weekends. If you're tired of spending money on plants that demand constant attention, subscribe and hit that like button. Here's what's actually happening in your garden right now. You're treating plants like furniture. You pick them because they look nice at the nursery. You arrange them in decorative patterns. You water them when they look sad. You feed them when the package tells you to. You replace them when they die. Then next season, you start over. It's an expensive outdoor decorating hobby that consumes your weekends and drains your bank account while producing almost nothing useful. Meanwhile, traditional Japanese gardeners look at the exact same space and see an economic system. Every plant has a job. Actually, every plant has 3 or 4 jobs simultaneously. Some pull nitrogen from the air and store it in root nodules that feed everything nearby. Some produce food for 20 or 30 years from a single planting. Some mine minerals from deep in the subsoil and bring them to the surface. Some create microclimates that protect vulnerable plants. Some confuse pests or attract beneficial insects. Beauty is just one function among many, definitely not the main goal. Think about it. Western gardening culture has trained you to see your yard as a canvas for visual decoration. You're supposed to fill beds with colorful annuals that live for 4 months, look stunning, then die. You're supposed to maintain a perfect lawn that gives you nothing except mowing obligations and fertilizer bills. You're supposed to buy solutions for every problem that emerges. Synthetic fertilizer because your soil is dead. Pesticides because your plants are too weak to defend themselves. Replacement plants every spring because nothing you installed last year survived winter. It's a perfectly engineered system for keeping garden centers profitable and keeping you busy and broke. But here's the reality. Japanese gardeners figured out hundreds of years ago that this entire approach is backwards. They watched how forests work. They studied which plants thrive in community with each other. They noticed which species improve conditions for everything around them instead of competing. They built gardens that become more productive and more stable over time, not less. The garden does more of the work. You do less of the work. Your wallet stays fuller. Your weekends stay freer. You're designing relationships instead of fighting entropy. Here's what most people miss about traditional Japanese garden design. It's not about Zen aesthetics or carefully raked gravel patterns. That's the tourist postcard version. The actual functional principle underneath all of it is economic efficiency through ecological relationships. You're selecting plants that create favorable conditions for each other. You're stacking functions in the same footprint, so every square foot generates multiple returns. You're thinking in decades and generations, not individual growing seasons. Let's start with the most fundamental wealth-building plant category that Western gardening almost completely ignores: nitrogen fixers. These plants have a relationship with bacteria that live in nodules on their roots. The bacteria pull nitrogen out of the air and convert it into forms that plants can use. When roots die back naturally, or when you chop the plant and drop it as mulch, that stored nitrogen feeds everything around it. You're manufacturing fertilizer in place for free, forever. Compare that to buying bags of synthetic nitrogen every spring. One approach costs you $30 to $60 annually and degrades your soil structure over time. The other approach builds fertility automatically while you do absolutely nothing. Siberian pea shrub is the first plant on this list. And here's why Japanese and Korean gardeners value it so highly. It fixes massive amounts of nitrogen through those root nodules, 50 to 100 pounds annually once it's mature. It produces edible pea pods that you can harvest and eat or leave for wildlife. It tolerates terrible soil, extreme cold, drought, and neglect. It grows fast enough to provide privacy screening or windbreak function. You plant one $5 shrub, and it works for you for 20 to 30 years. The peas aren't gourmet quality, but they're abundant and edible. More importantly, everything you plant near this shrub grows significantly better because of the nitrogen it's pumping into the soil constantly. Here's the wealth calculation on just this one plant. That 50 to 100 pounds of nitrogen it fixes annually is worth $30 to $60 in bagged fertilizer you're not buying every single year for decades. Plus, you're getting pea harvests you'd otherwise purchase at grocery stores. Plus, you're improving soil structure and organic matter content. Plus, you're getting privacy screening or wind protection. The initial $5 investment becomes a multi-$100 asset that keeps compounding value. Now let's talk about the second plant, comfrey. This might shock you, but comfrey is possibly the highest value perennial you can grow if you understand how to use it properly. The roots go down 10 feet deep into subsoil and mine minerals that shallow-rooted vegetables can't access. Potassium, phosphorus, calcium, trace elements. Those minerals get stored in the massive leaves. You chop the leaves 3 or 4 times per growing season and use them as mulch around your vegetables or fruit trees. You're delivering a custom-blended mineral fertilizer that costs $0 and takes maybe 15 minutes of labor per harvest. But here's where it gets interesting. Comfrey leaves also have traditional medicinal uses going back centuries. The plant contains allantoin, which speeds cell division and healing. You can make salves for cuts and scrapes, poultices for sprains and bruises, compresses for inflammation. A single plant produces enough leaf material to supply your entire household's basic first aid needs. You're replacing products that cost $20 to $40 at health food stores. Plus, comfrey is a perennial that spreads readily through root cuttings, so one plant becomes 10 plants within a few years if you want to expand. You're building a dual-purpose fertilizer and medicine operation that runs on complete autopilot. Third plant is walking onions, also called Egyptian onions or tree onions. Here's what makes them a perfect wealth-building choice for any garden. They're perennial onions that produce both bulbs underground like regular onions and little bulbils on top of the flower stalks. Those top bulbils get heavy as they mature, which bends the stalk down to the ground. The bulbils root where they touch soil. The plant literally walks across your garden bed and multiplies itself without any input from you. You plant it once and you have onions forever. No replanting every spring. No buying onion sets annually. Just free onions expanding across any space you give them. They tolerate shade, extreme cold, neglect, and poor soil. Japanese gardeners plant them in the understory of fruit trees where most Western gardeners would leave bare dirt or wood chip mulch. Calculate what you spend on onions in a year, even if it's just $20 or $30. That's money staying in your pocket permanently. Plus, you're filling space that would otherwise produce weeds. Plus, walking onions produce heavily in early spring when almost nothing else is ready to harvest yet. The wealth isn't just the dollar value of the onions themselves. It's the time you're not spending managing that space and the food security of knowing onions are coming every year without any maintenance. fourth plant is Korean licorice mint, also called Korean mint or hyssop. This one stacks so many functions, it's almost ridiculous. It's a perennial herb that produces aromatic leaves you can use for tea, cooking, or traditional medicine. The purple flower spikes are edible, and they attract beneficial insects like predatory wasps and hoverflies that prey on aphids and other garden pests. It self-seeds aggressively, so one $3 plant becomes 50 plants within 2 seasons. It tolerates poor soil, drought, and partial shade. Korean traditional medicine uses it for digestive issues, respiratory problems, and immune support. You're growing a tea crop, a pollinator magnet, a medicine cabinet, and a biological pest control system all in one plant that costs almost nothing and requires zero maintenance once established. Here's where most Western gardeners completely miss the strategy. You're thinking about individual plants and their isolated functions. Japanese gardeners are thinking about plant communities and relationships. They're designing interactions. They're asking which plants make each other more productive, more resilient, more valuable when grown together. This is where the wealth really starts to multiply. When you stack compatible plants in the same space, you're not just adding their individual outputs together, you're creating synergies that increase total system yield while actually decreasing total labor input. Fifth plant is asparagus. This might seem obvious, but here's what most people don't realize about the economics. Asparagus produces for 20 to 30 years from a single planting. Think about what you spend on asparagus at the grocery store. $5 to $7 per pound, sometimes more if it's out of season. A mature asparagus bed with maybe 20 plants can produce 10 to 20 pounds per year once it's fully established. You're looking at $50 to $140 in annual returns from a crop that requires almost zero maintenance after the first 2 years. You weed it once or twice the first season. After that, it's tall enough and vigorous enough to outcompete most weeds on its own. Japanese gardeners often interplant asparagus with strawberries or low-growing herbs because the asparagus provides light, dappled shade in summer after its harvest season ends in late spring. Sixth plant is rhubarb, another perennial that produces reliably for decades from one planting. The leaves are toxic, but the stalks are valuable for pies, jams, sauces, and traditional medicinal preparations. One mature plant produces 5 to 15 pounds of stalks annually once established. It tolerates cold, partial shade, and neglect better than almost any vegetable. It spreads slowly through the crown, so you can divide it every 4 or 5 years and turn one plant into 5 plants. You're building a permanent rhubarb supply from a single $10 root purchase. Compare that to buying rhubarb at farmers markets where it costs $3 to $6 per pound if you can even find it. Now let's talk about the seventh plant. And this is where it gets really interesting for people with limited space. Perennial kale. Most people think of kale as an annual crop you plant every spring from transplants. But perennial varieties like Dobbinton's kale or Tontondine just keep growing year after year. You harvest leaves continuously throughout the growing season. The plant keeps producing new growth. It never flowers and goes to seed, so it never develops that bitter taste that annual kale gets. It tolerates frost, summer heat, partial shade, and poor soil. Japanese kitchen gardens use perennial kale as a permanent vegetable source that fills gaps between seasonal annual crops. You plant it once in a container or garden bed, and you have fresh greens available 10 to 12 months per year, depending on your climate. Here's the wealth calculation. A grocery store bunch of kale costs $2 to $4. If you harvest the equivalent of just 2 bunches per week from a perennial kale plant during the growing season, that's $100 to $200 in annual value from a plant that cost maybe $5 initially and requires 5 minutes of maintenance monthly. But here's what really matters beyond the dollar calculation. You're not spending weekend time driving to stores or farmers markets. You're not dealing with produce that wilts in the refrigerator within 3 days. You're walking outside and cutting exactly what you need, exactly when you need it. Eighth plant is sea kale. This one is almost completely unknown in Western gardening, but traditional European and Asian coastal communities relied on it for centuries. It's a perennial vegetable that produces thick edible shoots in early spring and edible leaves throughout the growing season. It tolerates salt spray, strong wind, sandy soil, and drought conditions that would kill most vegetables. You're essentially growing a permanent asparagus alternative that thrives in marginal conditions where regular crops fail completely. One plant produces 2 to 4 pounds of shoots and several pounds of leaves annually. It self-seeds moderately, so you get volunteer seedlings that you can transplant to new locations or leave in place to expand the patch. Ninth plant is multiplier onions, which are different from the walking onions we discussed earlier. These produce clusters of bulbs underground. You plant one bulb in fall and harvest 5 to 8 bulbs the following summer. You replant one of those bulbs and eat the rest. The multiplication happens automatically and continuously. Japanese gardeners value these because they store well through winter, they're available for harvest over a long season, and they require almost no care beyond initial planting. You're building a permanent onion supply that expands itself exponentially. No buying onion sets every year. No starting from seed. Just continuous onion production from minimal space. 10th plant is Turkish rocket. This is a perennial salad green that produces leaves you can harvest 9 or 10 months per year in most climates. It self-seeds aggressively, so one plant becomes a permanent salad bed that refills itself every year. The flavor is peppery and strong, similar to arugula. You use it mixed with milder greens in salads. Traditional Turkish and Greek gardens rely on this as a staple vegetable that grows in cracks in pavement, on slopes, in poor rocky soil where nothing else will thrive. You're occupying marginal space that would otherwise be completely empty and turning it into continuous food production. Now let's talk about plants that specifically work together to increase total system value. This is the companion planting principle that Japanese gardeners refined over centuries of observation. 11th plant is Jerusalem artichoke, also called sunchoke. It's a perennial sunflower relative that produces edible tubers underground. It grows 8 to 10 feet tall and creates significant shade and wind protection for shade-tolerant plants underneath. The bright yellow flowers attract beneficial insects. The stalks die back in winter and create mulch in place that feeds the soil. You harvest tubers from fall through early spring whenever you need them because they store better in the ground than in your refrigerator. One plant turns into 20 plants within 2 years because the tubers multiply aggressively underground. Here's the layering strategy. You plant Jerusalem artichoke on the north side of a bed or along a fence line. Underneath, you plant shade-tolerant perennials like sorrel, Good King Henry, or woodland strawberries. The tall artichokes create a favorable microclimate with filtered shade and wind protection. The understory plants produce in space that would otherwise be wasted. You're stacking yields vertically in the same footprint. Japanese forest gardens use this exact principle with bamboo or fruit trees providing upper canopy, mid-sized shrubs providing middle layer, and low herbs and ground covers filling the ground layer. 12th plant is sorrel. It's a perennial leafy green with a bright lemony flavor used in salads, soups, and sauces. It tolerates full shade better than almost any edible plant, which makes it perfect for understory planting beneath taller perennials or shrubs. It produces tender leaves from early spring through late fall. One plant expands into a small productive patch within 3 years through self-seeding and crown division. Traditional French and Japanese cuisine both use sorrel extensively. You're growing a gourmet ingredient that costs $8 to $15 per pound at specialty markets when you can even find it. A small patch produces several pounds annually from space that wouldn't support sun-loving crops anyway. 13th plant is Good King Henry. This is a perennial spinach relative that produces edible leaves, tender shoots, and edible flower buds. It tolerates deep shade and genuinely poor soil. Traditional English and European cottage gardens used it as a reliable vegetable source for centuries before annual spinach became commercially common. The leaves taste similar to spinach when cooked. The shoots can be blanched and prepared like asparagus. The plant self-seeds moderately and spreads slowly through underground rhizomes. You're establishing a permanent spinach bed that requires zero replanting and thrives in conditions that most vegetables absolutely hate. 14th plant is alpine strawberries, also called woodland strawberries. These are completely different from regular June-bearing strawberries. They produce smaller berries continuously from late spring through fall instead of one concentrated flush. They tolerate significant shade, making them perfect for understory planting beneath taller perennials, shrubs, or even fruit trees. They self-seed aggressively. One plant becomes 50 plants within 2 years if you let the seedlings establish. Japanese temple gardens use alpine strawberries as productive edible ground cover beneath fruit trees and around the bases of nitrogen-fixing shrubs. You're turning bare soil into continuous berry production while suppressing weeds naturally through living mulch. Now here's where the system really starts compounding returns. You're not just planting these species individually in isolation. You're designing combinations and relationships. 15th plant is horseradish. The thick roots are the valuable harvest for making the spicy condiment, but here's what most people don't know. Horseradish leaves contain compounds that repel many common garden pests, including aphids, potato beetles, and cabbage worms. You plant horseradish at the base of fruit trees or in corners of beds near potatoes and brassicas. The leaves create a chemical pest deterrent zone around vulnerable crops. The roots expand underground, and you harvest sections as needed for fresh horseradish that costs $8 to $12 per small jar in stores. One plant spreads into a permanent horseradish patch that protects everything nearby while giving you a high-value condiment crop. 16th plant is lovage. This is a perennial herb that tastes like extremely intense celery. You use the fresh or dried leaves in soups, stocks, and stews. The thick stems can substitute for celery in cooking. The seeds work as a celery-flavored spice. One plant grows 5 to 6 feet tall and produces several pounds of usable material annually. It tolerates partial shade and poor soil. Traditional European cottage gardens relied on lovage as a celery substitute that requires zero maintenance once established. You're replacing a vegetable you might buy weekly at stores with a perennial plant that keeps producing for decades from one planting. 17th plant is sea buckthorn. This one is particularly valuable if you have space for a larger shrub. It fixes nitrogen in soil, just like Siberian pea shrub. It produces bright orange berries that are incredibly high in vitamin C, omega fatty acids, and antioxidants. The berries are too tart to eat fresh, but they make excellent juice, jam, syrup, and medicinal preparations. One mature shrub produces 10 to 20 pounds of berries annually. Those berries sell for $15 to $25 per pound at health food stores because of their exceptional nutritional density. You're building a nitrogen-fixing, soil-improving, wildlife-feeding, health-supporting system from one shrub that tolerates terrible soil, extreme cold, and coastal conditions. But here's the real strategy that Japanese gardeners perfected through centuries of observation. You're thinking about succession and timing. You're choosing plants that produce at different times throughout the year, so you have continuous harvests instead of feast or famine cycles. 18th plant is daylilies. The unopened flower buds are edible and considered a delicacy in Asian cuisine. The young shoots are edible in spring. The tubers are edible. You're getting 3 different harvest windows from one plant that most Western gardeners grow purely for ornamental value. Traditional Chinese and Japanese cooking uses dried daylily buds extensively in soups and stir-fries. They cost $10 to $20 per pound dried at Asian markets. A small patch of daylilies produces several pounds of fresh buds during the bloom season. You're harvesting gourmet vegetables from plants most people think are just decoration. 19th plant is bamboo, specifically clumping varieties that don't spread aggressively and invade your neighbor's yard. The young shoots are valuable spring vegetables. The mature canes are useful for trellising, plant stakes, and garden crafts. Bamboo creates permanent privacy screening and windbreaks. It grows in poor soil and tolerates various difficult conditions. Japanese gardeners use bamboo as structural infrastructure that also produces food. You're building permanent vertical elements that pay dividends in multiple ways. A small clump produces enough edible shoots for several meals each spring while providing materials you'd otherwise buy at garden centers every season. 20th plant is udo, also called Japanese spikenard. This one is almost completely unknown outside of Asia, but it's incredibly valuable for the right conditions. It's a perennial vegetable that produces thick, edible shoots in spring. The shoots are traditionally blanched by mounding soil over emerging growth to keep them pale and tender. They taste like a cross between asparagus and celery with a unique aromatic quality. Udo tolerates shade and spreads moderately through underground rhizomes. Traditional Japanese cuisine prizes udo shoots as a spring delicacy. You're growing a specialty vegetable that's nearly impossible to find in Western markets at any price. One plant expands into a permanent udo patch that produces pounds of shoots annually. Now let's talk about implementation, because this is where most people overthink everything and never actually start building the system. You don't need to plant all 20 species tomorrow. You don't need acreage. You don't need perfect soil to begin. Japanese wealth gardening scales perfectly from containers on an apartment balcony to full yards. The underlying principle stays the same regardless of total size. Start with 3 to 5 plants that match your specific conditions. Observe carefully what thrives in your microclimate. Expand based on demonstrated success rather than theory. Here's the foundation layer strategy. Start with nitrogen fixers if you have any ground space at all, Siberian pea shrub or sea buckthorn if you have room for shrubs, comfrey if you only have a small bed. These species improve conditions for everything you add later by building soil fertility automatically. If you only have containers on a balcony, start with perennial kale, alpine strawberries, and walking onions. These thrive in pots and give you immediate returns while building your observation skills and confidence. Second layer is production plants that deliver food harvests, asparagus and rhubarb if you have ground space and patience for establishment. Perennial kale and sorrel if you're working with containers or significant shade. These establish slowly the first year, but they're producing valuable harvests within 1 or 2 seasons. You're replacing weekly grocery purchases while learning what actually grows well in your specific microclimate and soil conditions. Third layer is the understory and companion plants that fill gaps. Alpine strawberries beneath taller plants, horseradish near fruit trees, or potatoes for pest protection. Turkish rocket in marginal spaces between established plants. You're filling empty niches and stacking yields in the same physical footprint. Japanese gardeners think vertically and temporally, not just horizontally. You're not just covering ground area. You're using the full 3-dimensional space from ground level to 6 feet high, and the full calendar year from early spring through late fall. The beauty of this system is that it becomes more valuable and more stable over time instead of degrading. Your nitrogen fixers continuously improve soil quality. Your perennial vegetables expand and produce more heavily as they mature and establish deeper root systems. Your self-seeding plants fill spaces and reduce maintenance by outcompeting weeds. You're building ecological relationships that do the actual work. You're observing and adjusting based on results instead of constantly fighting problems and replacing casualties. Here's what you need to remember. Garden centers profit when you fail and need to replant. Seed companies profit when you buy packets annually. Fertilizer companies profit when your soil stays depleted and dependent. This entire commercial system is designed to keep you dependent on external inputs. Japanese wealth gardening breaks that dependency completely. You're investing in perennial plants that improve conditions around them, multiply themselves through propagation, and produce for decades from one planting. You're choosing species based on function and resilience instead of marketing hype and temporary aesthetics. You're designing systems that give you time back instead of consuming every weekend. Stop maintaining. Start designing. Stop paying for annual solutions to recurring problems. Start building perennial wealth that compounds.